Hello, welcome to this video where we're going to go through installing the Reality XP GTN 750 into this Carenado V35B tip tank Bonanza. So since I've already gone through it and installed it on the Bonanza that I use for the air hauler series, I figured we do it with this other model and just kind of go through the steps to getting it installed. I don't use it in the virtual cockpit. Sadly, one of the things, unfortunately, that takes place is they already have a GNS 430 in this one. One of the things that Carenado does do, if you go into your Lockheed Martin sim objects, go into your airplanes, and if you find the planes, so in this case I'm going to go into the V35B tip tanks, don't have an installer in here or a modifier. So what happens usually, if I go to the A36, I'm pretty sure they had it, this RXP 430. So they have this little installer that they run, and it changes the panel and it changes the model so that they can replace GPS units with the Reality XP. Now obviously you have to have the Reality XP 430 installed, otherwise it's just dark screen. So we know right away that in this model there is nothing. So Carenado did not supply or build the model around replacing this. Now because you could get rid of the knobs, it's probably possible to install something else in its place, but obviously a 430 is smaller than a 530, and therefore it wouldn't fit. Now if you go in and you really get into modifying the file, which if there's a lot of requests for it, I can possibly look into it, but again, I don't really fly in the virtual cockpit. So if we get some comments and some requests, I could always look at seeing if the panel is modifiable. Usually what happens, because these 3D knobs were deletable, it makes it a little bit nicer because then they're hidden from the model. But usually what you can do then is we could say, for example, I don't care about an ADF. So I could remove the ADF from the stack in this part of the model. We could potentially move the autopilot down a little bit, which would allow us to move the COM2 NAV2 down a little bit, hopefully giving us exactly the extra space needed, and potentially replace the GNS 430 with the GNS 530. Also maybe change the audio panel for the sake of changing the audio panel. We're just going to focus on install the pop out so that it can be placed inside of an external panel. In the sim we have a 530 which I 3D printed, and then I built switches connected to an Arduino, and that Arduino allows us to have buttons and knobs. After going through all the 3D printing, building of custom boards, and all of that, I discovered that there was a great company called RealSimGear. They make very cost-effective solutions once you factor in what it costs to get this properly 3D printed. Now, yes, if you own a 3D printer at home, yes, that would have saved me a lot of money, because doing a high-quality print on this probably would have only cost $10 in PLA. Versus spending $120 to get it printed, because you have to buy a screen, and by the time you add it all up, you start getting the price up, especially when you think of the concentric knobs. I mean, these are from Prop Wash, they're about $20 a pop. Little tactile buttons, little boards, and then an Arduino, and of course a lot of wires. Now the GTN 750 from RealSimGear is a fantastic unit, and I wasn't going to go through the hassle of redoing this once I saw the price point. And again, this guy's about $399 US, so to buy this from RealSimGear at $399 versus building it, it just would have been a lot cleaner. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my menu, so unhide my menu. So we're going to go to add-ons, and we're going to go to the Reality XP GTN. Now, I am assuming that you figured out how to run the installer and get your software installed. I am not going to show you how to do that. Sorry, it's already installed. So we're going to set up the GTN first. So because I'm not replacing the existing gauge, I want to configure a GTN pop-up window. Now, we will end up going in and making modifications to the config file. We have no choice. It's unfortunate, but I find that the replacing of gauges in the panel does a much better job of the options and what you can do. So for now, we are going to do it as a pop-up. Which device? Well, we want one window or two windows. Well, I'm only putting in one GTN device, so one window. And I want the 750. What is the difference between the 600 series and the 700 series? It's physical size, and if you didn't buy the 600 series licenses, these will be black. A 625 is nav only, a 635 is a COM with GPS, and the 650 is a COM, nav, and comes with the nav radio. So a GTN 725 is a similar type thing. This comes in a navigational unit only, where you would have separate radios, or it comes in the 750 model, which has a COM, a NavCom, and the GPS navigation. So we want that. Now, where do we want it to show up when it pops out? We're going to put it on the lower left, just because we can. It could be a 1-to-1 scale, could be a half scale. We'll just leave it 1-to-1 scale. Visibility with any view. Alright, this is where I wish there was an option right now to allow me to hide the bezel. I want a pop out, and I'm going to drag the pop out into a hardware panel. It would be wonderful if we could have that setting here. What would also be nice is if you could have the setting here when you're making these pop outs as to which unit it's actually supposed to be. This comes in later when we're going to do the 530, combining the two. Let's continue. So right away, it is going to not do anything to the existing Carenado 430. It's going to leave that where it is. This is going to create a new pop-out window, and that new pop-out window will open up the 750. And it's not putting it into the virtual cockpit because we are not replacing anything. So we go ahead and we accept. We have added our GPS. So that's pretty cool. It's pretty quick for what you have to do to install it, and it automatically kind of reloaded the aircraft for us. Because this has a bezel, it's easy to grab onto it and move it around. If you leave the bezel, grabbing on is not difficult. Now, one of the things that we find out pretty quick is as soon as we change this to the no bezel, we're going to find out that we can't grab it. And this bothered me for a while. I went to the forums, and sure enough, in the forums, there is a great suggestion to go out of full screen mode, undock it, drag it off the screen, and then go back into full screen mode. So we'll see that in a minute. So first up, let's go ahead and let's configure some of the settings that we need to configure here. So if I hold the shift and I right click, that will open the settings. If I hold the shift and I left click, that's going to resize it. So we just want to bring up the menu. Now, because I'm bringing this one in, keep that visible, we do definitely want this to be our master device. At the end of the day, we're going to use this to drive our GPS, and we want that to drive our master device. We want the GPS to connect to the autopilot. So we definitely want the autopilot to be driven by this, and we want to connect the GPS to the HSI. Now, we could connect HSI course for auto slew, connect HSI OBS for input. Now, where that comes in, say you didn't have an HSI, but you had two VORs. This GPS to HSI may not connect to it because that VOR could be using the VOR. So you'd actually come and say, I want to connect the GPS to VOR, and so that it'll drive it. Same thing with the HSI OBS input. So again, it depends on how these gauges have been configured and where the data that the airplane is using. So we may need to enable some of these if this Carenado plane, when we go flying, turns out to have things configured in a different way. And what's nice is they're giving you all the options, and the manual does explain each one of these very clearly. It does mean, though, sometimes it's a little bit of trial and error. You may have read the manual and it may make sense that your settings are correct, but you really have to understand it depends on the plane that you're installing it in. They have some nice options as well for the air data computers and the fuel data computer for how they do the calculations. If you want to use the audio panel at 750, there's a checkbox, and this is nice because now it gives me a touchscreen audio panel control. Same thing with the transponder, so controlling the transponder. And you can have a default, so when you tell it to go back into standby mode or VFR mode, default mode, hey, what is my default code? Or what's neat is you can go into the INI file and you can set up your own default if you want. Very cool. You could use a different TCAD. Which database do you want to use? Worldwide Jepson, North American Garmin, America's Rotorcraft Jepson, or the North American Rotorcraft. Now this is going to come up a little bit later, but since we're flying in North America, we'll quickly flip here. And yes, it will require a reboot because it's going to use a different database. Now, what you need to understand about the databases is these air racks are provided by Garmin, meaning because they built this off the simulator, and the GTN is completely built off the Garmin simulator. That's why it's so good and so accurate. So do you want terrain proximity? Do you want TAWS B or TAWS A? So different systems and how they behave. And then with your TAWS options, you can set your hard and soft for surfaces, and then your minimum runway length. When we get down to gauge options, so ownership icon, so you can auto detect and it'll figure out based on the plane, or you can pick, your own icon you want. So we'll leave it in auto detect. Here is where we're telling it which radio this one is going to behave as. Now it's very clear to understand that this does not mean that when we set up button commands that this will behave based on COM2 NAV2. This is just what this one is going to hook up to. And there'll be more on that in a separate video. So this is the primary, COM1 NAV1, VLOC source, automatic NAV1, or it could be NAV1. Meaning for the VLOC, it can automatically perform the assignment, or you could leave it in a non-auto assignment mode so that you're still manually required to do it. Again, it all depends on how you've configured the real-world device in your plane, or in the case of just pure simulation, which behavior you want to simulate. Fuel type, avgas. This is needed for weights and balances, as well as to calculate what they actually are getting. Clock source, is it coming from simulator or is it coming from a computer? So simulator it is. Power source, avionics on, always on, general panel on. So you can set up how this is going to use which data to provide the intelligence for, again, simulating. So I use the avionics on. That way, as I use my switches on my panels, then all the avionics behave like they really would. You can do a half rate screen update. So if you want to save some resources on your computer, if you feel that it's taken a bit of a hit, you can go ahead and you can change your settings there. So that's nice. Cut the frame rate in half, and then that way you can, save resources. So for the audio settings, I'm going to use a female. I am going to put that volume around, 60. We'll see how it sounds. Use with window focus. I don't do that because sometimes I have to pop out to OBS or other applications. So I want the audio to always be functioning. And you'll notice some of these require a reboot. Advanced settings. Do you want to enable failures? Do you want to use simulator GPS commands? Yes. I need this enabled so that I can program buttons to control the user interface. Now, auto update simulator, GPS waypoints, auto save, root, use legacy mouse knobs handling. Again, I'm going to use real knobs and buttons, so I don't need that. You could be auto-saving the active flight plan. That can be helpful because that will go into the sim flight plan and save it if you want that showing up everywhere. I don't want that because I use Active Sky, and Active Sky is setting my flight plan anyway. Auto update simulator GPS waypoints. This I would use if I wanted to make sure that the other sim-based GPS unit, so non-GTN unit, is going to also see those GPS points as I add them. Set your scale for your deviation, and then finally they have these, cool little items like CDI key. You could disable the CDI key. I want it enabled so that way I can toggle the CDI. Select course for GPS. So here it's automatically going to select the course on your course 1. So same thing, so basically your HSI, that's enabled. Great. Select course for VLOC. So the same thing, when you enable your VLOC, like transitioning over to the ILS, this unit here is going to automatically set that for me. Again, if I'm in the real world and my system is not capable of doing that because that wasn't integrated that way, I could disable this so that I am required to enter that information manually. So I have to dial up the course manually. Again, it depends on what you have to do in the real world. I'm going to leave this one set to disabled and make me manually have to change it. V-flag to clutter. Set what your default is. Main system. So GPS selected prompt, meaning will this automatically enable it, or will it prompt you that you have to manually then change the settings? So we're going to leave that in auto, so it'll auto step through. Navigation features. Vertical nav type. Do you want VCalc, where it'll just calculate it for you and give you the information, or do you want it to be true VNav? In which case, transition to approach is enabled, so it'll automatically transition from VNav to approach mode. Your VDI scale, you can set how many feet, so by default 500. Transition altitude, again, the default in North America is flight level 180 or 18,000 feet. I believe it's different in Europe and other places may be different. RF procedure legs, how does it handle those? So you can enable those, disable them, mark on target, enable or disable. Okay, those are the settings, how we want it. So we are going to accept, and it is going to now do a reboot. And so it's going to literally load, and it reloaded without having to dump the sim, which is pretty awesome. Now, the problem we have right now is, yes, we can click on this, we could undock this window, we can now take this, and I can slide it over here, and so then I can grab the edge, go to the edge, grab the top, go to the top. Now, the problem with this, of course, is now we've got the bezel inside of the unit. And it's kind of not going to be helpful for us because there's all that screen real estate that's wasted. It's also going to skew the aspect ratio. What do I mean by that? So let's just turn on the battery and let's turn on the avionics master. Now this is one thing I have seen with the GTN 750. Sometimes you literally have to turn the avionics off, turn the avionics back on for it to register. By dragging this full it's squished, it doesn't line up, it doesn't look nice. You can click on everything and it all works, but it doesn't fill in, for example, the RealSimGear GTN bezel very well because it's missing all kinds of the pixels. The part that you have to do next to make this work, here I've got the pop out as opposed to clicking on it to pop it out, so it's not built in. So what we're going to do now is we are going to go into our add-ons. So we're going to go into Lockheed Martin. We're going to go into sim objects. We're going to go into airplanes. And now when we go into our tip tank, you'll notice there is now a RealityXP GTN file available. I love using Notepad++. Easy to right click and open. Big fan of Notepad++. We've got our options, and here is the master device, true, so GTN 750_1. And so when we come down, there are some general, so .1 .default. And yes, you could copy and paste this, and instead of .default, make this .popup, and then edit your panel file. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to change this no bezel from false to true. So now we're going to save it. And so now that's the file. All we have to do is reload again. So I have a button programmed on my other yoke literally to reload the sim object. So it'll actually reload the current aircraft. We have no bezel, but you'll notice it creates for us a problem. Whole area is considered the touch area, so the click on area. So what I need to do, and this is where it was getting really confusing. The suggestions were add a little bit of a border to it, try to grab a hold of that. But then I found I'd click on it, and then all of a sudden it was dragging, and it was a pain. It really was a pain. So the easiest way we found was a great suggestion from another member was to exit out of full screen mode. So if we go ahead and we hit Alt Enter, we come out of full screen mode, click in the area. So I've clicked inside the area, but you need to go to views and undock the view so it'll give it its own separate window. So now with that, I'm going to drag it down into the lower screen. Going to click on the maximize icon there so it fills the screen. So right now it does have a bit of a bar. And so if we use, for example, the view for when we normally are recording, you can see the little bar. So that bar is there, and yeah, you could live with the bar, but then you've also got the bar at the top of your sim. So normally, once you've dragged it over, click back into the main area, and you hit Alt-Enter, and everything goes back into full screen mode. We have our GTN installed. It can calculate what we have for fuel. It can calculate all of the information for us. It's the process, really, for installing and making it available to be dragged out and put onto a separate screen. You just have to do that one little edit. It's not a big deal, but it would have been nicer if during the install process it gave you that as a flaggable option. Or even in the settings, if inside of the settings, since you have all these boxes and all these reloads anyway, it also would have been a lot nicer if they could have added that as one of those options to just turn the bezel off. So with that, we're going to cut it here and we'll end this episode. Keep it just to how to install the GTN 750 into the cockpit and modifying the file to get it into an external device like the RealSimGear GTN 750 module. On the next one, what we're going to do is we're going to fly with the GTN from KSAN up to KPSP. We will do a departure, an arrival, and we'll do the procedure, giving us the full feature set of why it is that we want to be using one of these aftermarket GPS units that properly simulates and gives us that ability to really hone our skill and operate with it. Plus, we'll be able to go through some of the feature set that we've added and gotten configured and working. Look for that coming up shortly. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please hit that like button. If you haven't subscribed yet, consider subscribing and come join us on the next one.